The price of absolute control rarely appears on a public ledger, but someone always pays it. In the federal system, that bill rises quietly year after year. Long before most Americans ever heard its name, the costs were already accumulating in a remote stretch of southern Colorado. Few outside government circles were paying attention. The facility is officially known as the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility, commonly called ADX Florence. It sits near Florence, Colorado, and holds some of the most tightly controlled federal inmates. Built to contain individuals considered the highest security risks in the Bureau of Prisons, ADX quickly developed a reputation as the most restrictive federal prison in the country. That reputation carries a price tag far beyond what many people expect. Operating ADX costs significantly more per inmate than housing prisoners in standard high-security institutions. According to federal budget reports and oversight analyses, the annual cost per inmate at ADX has often been substantially higher than the federal average across other facilities. In some reporting years, estimates placed ADX's per inmate cost at more than double that of lower-security federal prisons. But the reasons behind that gap are layered. Unlike medium or low-security institutions, ADX operates with an intense staffing model. Correctional officers, specialized response teams, medical personnel, and administrative staff are required in higher ratios. Higher staff-to-inmate ratios mean more salaries, more training, and more overtime. Personnel expenses form the largest share of the Bureau of Prisons budget nationwide. At ADX, that burden is amplified by design. Most inmates are confined to single cells for approximately 23 hours a day, requiring individualized supervision and controlled movement. Even routine activities demand staffing resources. Escorting one inmate to recreation, medical appointments, or legal visits can require multiple officers under strict security protocols. That level of control does not come cheaply. Salaries, benefits, and hazard compensation for employees in high-security roles push operational budgets upward. But staffing is only part of the equation. The physical structure of ADX was engineered for maximum security, and maintaining that infrastructure is expensive. The facility incorporates reinforced concrete construction, electronic door systems, surveillance cameras, and layered perimeter defenses designed to minimize escape risk and inmate interaction. Specialized security hardware requires ongoing maintenance contracts, replacement components, and technical support. When systems fail, repairs cannot wait. Compared to older federal penitentiaries built decades earlier, ADX relies more heavily on technology to manage isolation. Technology reduces unpredictability, but increases operational complexity. Electric locking mechanisms, monitored communication systems, and advanced perimeter detection tools all contribute to higher fixed costs than traditional manual operations. Utilities also play a role. Maintaining climate control, lighting, and security electronics across a supermax complex adds consistent overhead, regardless of inmate population levels. By contrast, lower security facilities often rely on dormitory-style housing and shared spaces. Those designs reduce infrastructure intensity and allow fewer staff per inmate. The Bureau of Prisons publishes aggregate operating budgets annually. When those figures are divided by inmate population, the cost differences between facility types become clearer. Medium security institutions generally report significantly lower per capita expenses. Minimum security camps are even less costly, sometimes operating at a fraction of ADX's per inmate rate. So why does the federal government sustain such a high-cost model? The answer lies in risk management. ADX houses individuals convicted of terrorism, large-scale organized crime leadership, espionage, and violent offenses committed inside other prisons. Many were transferred after assaults on staff or other inmates in previous institutions. Housing them in standard settings had already proven unstable. From a policy perspective, officials have argued that concentrating the highest-risk inmates in one controlled environment reduces broader system-wide security threats. If a single violent incident in a lower-security prison can injure staff or trigger lockdowns affecting thousands of inmates, the financial ripple effects can be substantial. Legal liabilities, medical treatment, investigations, and overtime expenditures can quickly surpass routine operating costs. In that sense, ADX represents preventive spending. But critics question whether the financial trade-off is as straightforward as it appears. They point to long-term confinement conditions and their downstream consequences. Extended isolation has been the subject of lawsuits and court scrutiny, including challenges alleging constitutional violations related to mental health treatment. Litigation itself carries costs. Federal attorneys, expert witnesses, court proceedings, and potential settlements add financial pressure beyond daily operations. What followed surprised even experienced observers. Over time, mental health care requirements inside supermax facilities began influencing budget allocations more than initially anticipated. Inmates with severe psychiatric conditions require specialized treatment staff, medication management, and monitoring protocols that increase expenditures. As federal oversight evolved, additional mental health units were developed within ADX to address these concerns, further expanding operational spending. Healthcare in federal prisons is already a major budget category. At ADX, the concentration of high-risk and often long-term inmates intensifies those demands. Chronic medical care, secure transportation to outside hospitals when necessary, and enhanced monitoring procedures increase both direct and indirect costs. Few people outside ever learned how complex the financial structure truly is. ADX is not a standalone entity in budgetary terms. It operates as part of the federal correctional complex in Florence, which includes other institutions and shares certain administrative and support services. Shared infrastructure can offset some expenses, but supermax-specific requirements remain distinct. The core security model cannot be diluted without altering its purpose. Even inmate population numbers affect cost calculations. ADX houses far fewer inmates than many large federal prisons, meaning fixed costs are distributed across a smaller group. When occupancy fluctuates, the per-inmate cost can rise further, since staffing and infrastructure expenses do not decrease proportionally. By comparison, a crowded medium-security prison spreads its operating costs over thousands of individuals, lowering the per capita figure even if total spending is high. This creates a paradox. The most secure prison in the federal system may house fewer inmates, yet require a disproportionately larger share of resources per person. And that raises a question that continues to shape federal corrections policy. How much is absolute containment worth? When lawmakers review federal prison budgets, they rarely focus on a single name. Funding is allocated system-wide, and ADX is embedded within that broader financial structure. The Bureau of Prisons operates dozens of institutions across multiple security levels, each designed with different staffing patterns, architectural models, and operational philosophies. In minimum security camps, inmates often live in dormitory housing with limited perimeter fencing. Movement is less restrictive, and supervision requirements are comparatively lighter. Because of that structure, fewer officers are needed per inmate. Lower staffing density translates directly into reduced salary obligations and smaller overtime burdens. Medium security facilities introduce controlled movement and secure housing units, but still rely on shared spaces and group programming to manage populations. Even high-security penitentiaries, though heavily guarded, allow more interaction among inmates than ADX's near-continuous isolation model. At ADX, individual confinement is central to daily operations. That design requires additional coordination for every movement, no matter how routine. One inmate leaving a cell can trigger a cascade of procedures, including communication between control centers, escort assignments, and documentation requirements. Multiply that process across dozens of inmates each day, and staffing hours accumulate quickly. Labor becomes the dominant operational expense. But that was not the only factor driving the cost gap. Recruitment and retention also play a role in long-term spending. Supermax environments are demanding workplaces. The psychological strain on correctional officers can be significant, contributing to turnover and training cycles. Training new officers is not inexpensive. Background checks, academy instruction, field training programs, and certification processes require time and funding. Experienced staff often earn higher wages based on tenure and specialized roles. Hazard pay and locality adjustments further increase compensation packages. When vacancies occur, remaining staff frequently cover shifts through overtime. Overtime rates inflate payroll figures beyond baseline salary projections. By contrast, lower security institutions may experience fewer high-intensity incidents requiring specialized response teams or extended lockdown staffing. Incident response at ADX, even when infrequent, demands preparedness. Tactical equipment, controlled entry systems, and contingency planning are maintained regardless of daily stability. Maintaining readiness adds hidden costs. Equipment must be inspected, replaced, and updated according to federal procurement standards. Technology refresh cycles also influence budgets. Surveillance systems and digital monitoring tools cannot remain static indefinitely. Periodic upgrades are necessary to address cybersecurity risks and mechanical obsolescence. Each modernization phase introduces new expenditures. The physical environment of ADX further complicates financial analysis. The reinforced concrete design limits where from inmate damage, but repairs remain specialized. Replacing reinforced doors, secure glazing, or electronic locking assemblies requires contracted expertise rather than routine maintenance crews. Contract services introduce procurement procedures and compliance requirements, often extending timelines and increasing labor costs. Yet proponents argue that these expenses serve a broader financial logic. Concentrating the highest-risk inmates in one location can reduce incidents elsewhere. If a violent actor remains in a standard penitentiary, the costs of repeated assaults, lockdowns, and medical treatment may ripple outward. Temporary facility-wide lockdowns disrupt work programs and require additional staffing. Those interruptions carry measurable financial consequences. Transfers between institutions also generate transportation expenses, security escorts, and administrative coordination across multiple regions. By isolating individuals assessed as extreme security risks, the Bureau of Prisons aims to stabilize other institutions and limit cascading disruptions. Still, critics point to the cumulative price of long-term solitary housing. Inmates at ADX can remain for years under restrictive conditions. Long stays increase healthcare costs, particularly as inmates age. Aging prisoners typically require more frequent medical intervention. Secure transport to outside hospitals often involves multiple officers and coordination with local law enforcement, adding to operational spending. Medication costs, particularly for chronic conditions or mental health treatment, accumulate over extended sentences. And while ADX houses some of the most serious offenders in federal custody, it does not generate revenue that offsets its expenses. Federal prisons are taxpayer-funded institutions. Work programs exist, but they do not meaningfully subsidize operating costs. Unlike state systems that may rely more heavily on inmate labor revenue, the federal model does not treat facilities as profit centers. That reality makes cost comparisons unavoidable. When per-inmate spending at ADX significantly exceeds national averages, questions follow. Is the added expense justified by measurable reductions in system-wide violence? The answer is not always transparent. Data on incidents prevented is inherently difficult to quantify. Absence of violence does not produce a visible statistic. Supporters argue that the rarity of successful escapes or coordinated internal disruptions at ADX demonstrates functional effectiveness. The facility has never experienced a successful escape. That record is frequently cited as evidence of security value. But security success is not easily translated into dollar terms. Legislators must weigh preventive benefit against ongoing fiscal commitment. Some policy analysts suggest that reforms in classification systems could reduce the number of inmates assigned to supermax confinement. If fewer individuals meet the criteria for placement, occupancy declines, and per-inmate costs may rise even further due to fixed expenses. That creates another paradox. Downsizing the population does not necessarily shrink the budget proportionally. Staffing levels cannot be reduced below certain thresholds without compromising security design, even if inmate numbers decrease. So the cost debate extends beyond raw figures. It touches on philosophy, containment versus integration within controlled environments. Other federal high-security prisons operate under different management models, emphasizing structured group housing with enhanced monitoring. Those facilities report lower per capita expenditures, though they may manage higher incident rates. Comparative studies have examined recidivism and behavioral outcomes among inmates released from supermax units versus other settings. Results vary, and long-term financial implications of those outcomes remain contested. Few outside the corrections community fully grasp the scale of federal prison spending overall. ADX represents only a fraction of the total budget. Yet its symbolic status magnifies scrutiny. The most secure prison in America naturally invites examination of its price. And beneath every spreadsheet lies the same unresolved tension. Whether maximum isolation is a financial safeguard or an escalating commitment with no simple endpoint. Behind every annual budget request, projections attempt to predict future stability. In corrections, stability is expensive, and unpredictability can be even more costly. As federal prison populations fluctuate, overall expenditures shift with them. Declines in inmate numbers across the system have not erased fixed costs. ADX illustrates this reality clearly. Even when population levels decrease, the core security infrastructure remains intact and fully staffed. Control units cannot simply be powered down. Surveillance, perimeter monitoring, and emergency response teams must remain operational regardless of daily census counts. That means the cost per inmate can rise when the population falls, even if total spending holds steady. Efficiency metrics become more complicated. Some policymakers have questioned whether alternative high-security units within existing penitentiaries could achieve similar control at lower cost. Creating secure housing units inside larger prisons may reduce the need for a standalone supermax model. But the comparison is not exact. ADX was purpose-built from the ground up for isolation and layered security. Retrofitting older prisons requires significant capital investment. Renovations involve construction, electronic upgrades, and operational redesign, which carry upfront costs that can rival new facility expenses. In budget terms, capital expenditures and operating expenses are often separated. But taxpayers ultimately fund both categories. The debate over ADX's financial footprint intensified during periods of broader criminal justice reform discussion. As sentencing reforms reduced some federal inmate populations, calls emerged to reassess the scale and necessity of supermax confinement. Advocates argued that prolonged solitary housing is not only costly, but potentially counterproductive for rehabilitation outcomes. Federal officials responded by adjusting classification reviews and creating step-down programs that allow certain inmates to transition out of ADX. Step-down units introduce additional staffing needs for programming and evaluation, slightly reshaping the cost structure. However, even with transitional pathways, the supermax core remains focused on containment over rehabilitation. That emphasis reflects the types of offenses and behavioral histories associated with ADX placements. Individuals convicted of terrorism-related crimes, espionage, or extreme violence often serve lengthy sentences, reducing turnover rates. Lower turnover means the facility does not frequently cycle inmates through intake and release processes. While that may reduce certain administrative costs, it increases long-term healthcare and aging-related expenditures. As inmates grow older within high-security confinement, medical complexity typically rises. Chronic illnesses, mobility limitations, and specialized treatments demand expanded healthcare coordination. Providing that care within a supermax environment requires secure medical units and escorted movement protocols. If outside treatment is necessary, transportation costs multiply. Multiple officers, secure vehicles, and coordination with external hospitals are standard. Each transfer temporarily removes staff from other duties, adding indirect labor costs. Yet supporters maintain that centralizing the highest-risk inmates avoids similar burdens across multiple institutions. If those individuals were dispersed throughout the system, high-intensity monitoring and incident response would need replication elsewhere. Spreading supermax-level security across several prisons could multiply equipment, training, and staffing costs system-wide. Concentration, in that view, represents cost containment rather than excess. Still, fiscal scrutiny continues. Government accountability reports periodically examine whether resources align with measurable outcomes. Budget transparency has improved over time, but precise facility-level breakdowns are not always publicly detailed. That lack of granular data fuels debate about true per-inmate figures and long-term projections. Comparisons to state-level supermax facilities further complicate the discussion. Some state supermax prisons report lower per-inmate costs, but operate under different staffing contracts and benefit structures. Federal employee compensation packages, including retirement and healthcare benefits, often exceed many state systems. Those differences make direct cost comparisons difficult without contextual adjustment. Beyond dollars, policymakers also consider reputational cost. ADX symbolizes the outer boundary of American incarceration policy. International observers and domestic advocacy groups frequently reference the facility in discussions about solitary confinement standards. Legal compliance reviews, mental health evaluations, and policy audits all require administrative resources. Oversight is part of the expense of operating a prison under federal constitutional constraints. Every audit, inspection, and compliance review involves personnel time and documentation processes. These indirect expenditures rarely appear in simplified cost comparisons, yet they shape the overall financial landscape. Ultimately, ADX operates within a tension between security imperatives and fiscal responsibility. The federal government continues to fund it because decision-makers conclude that certain risks demand extraordinary containment. Whether that calculation remains sustainable depends on shifting crime patterns, sentencing trends, and political priorities. If federal inmate populations continue to decline, pressure to reassess fixed high-cost facilities may increase. Conversely, if emerging threats require concentrated security responses, the supermax model may retain institutional support. For now, ADX remains the most expensive per-inmate environment in the federal system, a deliberate investment in maximum control. Its cost cannot be separated from its mission, and its mission cannot be measured purely in dollars. The question is not only how much it costs, but what alternatives would cost in its absence. That question has no simple ledger entry and no universal answer. If this story kept you watching, the next one will stay with you even longer. Subscribe for more real prison documentaries.